Riverside is situated 5 miles north of Kansas City along the Missouri River. Its history is remarkable after suffering through 3 500-year floods in its nearly 180-year existence, where each time it bounced back stronger than before. This was risking everything. This is the Riverside Story.
Massive ice sheets spread out as glaciers across much of North America.
The Ice Age lasted over 2 million years and ended only 12,000 years ago, forming the bend in the Missouri River. It was over a mile thick, and it is believed that enabled man to enter North America.
The Renner-Brenner Site Park represents just one piece of a large 5,000-year-old puzzle. Our earliest known visitors were the Archaic people, also known as the Nebo Hill culture, from 3 to 5,000 years ago. Their artifacts were found on the upper ridges on Northwest Gateway, High Drive and Indian Hills. During that time the Missouri River was still much higher as it was still draining water runoff from the glaciers. About 3,000 years ago the Archaic culture morphed into the early woodland who settled down and made Riverside their home. The earliest of these people were known for their black sand pottery. The black sand was a result of the kind of silt the river was leaving behind at the time. 2,000 years ago, the Hopewell culture influenced those at the Renner-Brenner site in the type and style of artifacts and pottery. Riverside reached its prehistoric population peak about the year 375 and the woodland people transitioned into the Mississippian culture by the year 700. The main difference between the two was the introduction of the bow and arrow and transitioning from mound building to stone-lined vaults. The Mississippians eventually became the ancestors to our modern-day Indians. All cultural groups in the last 5,000 years are represented by artifacts recovered in and around the Renner-Brenner Site Park.
Lewis and Clark were in their early 30s when given the order by Thomas Jefferson to explore the West. After rowing 5 miles upstream from the Kansas River, the expedition made camp at the mouth of Wolf Creek. Clark noted,
"A court-martial was set this day at 11 o'clock for the trial of John Collins and Hugh Hall, charged with getting drunk on his post this morning out of whiskey put under his charge as a sentinel. Punishment take place at 3:30 this evening. William Clark, June 29, 1804.
Today we call it Line Creek. The Brenner family with other families and relatives bought a boat to travel all together to America in 1843. The voyage was hardly considered a cruise, especially for those less fortunate who had tickets on regular passenger boats. They brought with them fruit trees, animal stock, seeds and all their personal possessions. They crossed the Atlantic, entering the Gulf of Mexico, and at New Orleans they engaged the passage up the Mississippi to the Missouri River. While some decided to make their home in Liberty, the rest made their way to what would become Brenner Ridge. Today we know it as Northwest Gateway north of Vivian Road. Heavy rains lasting for days kept the immigrants from any spring planting.
So, now what are we going to do, Brenner? It's raining like hell and you won't be able to get the crops in. Look. Let's just pack up and go home. I don't want to live in the rain. Brenner. You are a stubborn old man.
Us. I say we stay and build our church. A place where we can meet and help each other.
A log church was quickly built and was named St. Peter's, and today, we call it St. Matthew's.
We're gonna survive this thing, somehow.
Much of which still exists today.
And Maddie told us a story about bushwhackers coming to their house. The men tore down the gate and approached. They said they would kill Father if he didn't open the door and demanded money and guns. Father offered an old handgun and rifle. She found her father's rifle hopelessly bent out of shape against a fence. The bushwhackers had gone down to the Speck Renner home down by the bushwhackers' Old Line Creek Bridge. Speck shot him dead before reaching the top of the ridge. The other men took off after the shot. Carol Chamberlain Brenner.
Peter Brenner served 69 days in the 39th Enrolled Missouri Militia and was discharged on May 4, 1863. He received $8.72 pay for providing his own horse. His father, Henry Brenner, passed away a few months later on September 23 at 74 years of age. The first professional archaeological attempts were by Professor Fouke in 1909, where he estimated most all or parts of all the 20 burials mounds had been partially destoried either through scientific attempts or residential efforts. Fouke took this photo on his 1910 return visit. Modern view looking south on Pawnee at what was the location of the two largest mounds. It wasn't until 1921, when Met Shippey discovered the Renner site, that anyone made the connections to the mounds.
Eugene Keller owned land between the river and the bluffs at and east of today's Garney Waterfall. Here, he is in front of one of his cider barns with his wagon loaded with barrels. John W. Brenner and his wife, Bessie, entertaining friends feeding a hungry dog about 1915. Their house was just south of today's Eagle Animal Hospital. A Gail Stockwell photo of the same home. About the same view today. Each year the John Deere salesman would come to Brenner Ridge and was welcomed with a large crowd and a big feast. There are a couple different photos of this same picnic where it was obvious the photographer asked everyone to remove their hats. And another perhaps the next year. Among the immigrant families were Gustav and Marie van de Populaire, shown here with their son, Marcel, with a wagon load of vegetables for the city. St. Matthew's 1914 confirmation class. Ferdinando Filger is in the back row far left. The young woman on the front row, far left, is Carolina Brenner. Annual church picnic with Charles John P. Brenner, William Renner, and William Brenner. Blocks of ice were cut from Line Creek and stored all year round by packing them with sawdust in a special barn. Albert was the son of John Peter, and he built his home high along the bluff now called the Palisades. It was the first known house in southern Platte County to have running water and lights. Water was gravity-fed from an uphill storage tank or well. The lights were gas-fed from cow manure piped into the home from a deep hole. It was raised in 2005 after 107 years. Today, part of the driveway are still visible along the walking trail. A photo simply titled, "Fox Hunting on Brenner Ridge."
The Interurban Railroad was an electric, high-speed trolley that connected Kansas City, North Kansas City, Riverside, St. Joseph, Liberty, and Excelsior Springs. For more than 20 years, the Interurban was a virtual miracle of transportation. It was billed as the world's fastest interurban and offered elegant steel cars with plush green seats. The wide, arched windows were decorated with cathedral panels and backlit with tungsten lamps, with a top speed of more than 70 miles per hour. The two-story Brenner station was located on the hillside northeast of the current Red X and was owned by Albert Brenner. It opened in 1916 and served as a store and shipping station. The other station consisted of a 20-foot canopy next to the railway at the present smaller fountain at West Platte and Riverside Boulevard, only open during the horse track season. The track lay close to the bluff around Indian Hills. Across the interurban bridge, then ran beside AA Highway through Northmore and on north. During its best year in 1923, the interurban receipts totaled $1 million. 6 years later this dropped to $120,000. Saw the interurban make its last trip in 1933. Bankrupt.
I'm Elizabeth Sheichels Estes, and we used to ride the interurban to St. Joe shopping and to Kansas City shopping, and my sister, my mother, and I rode it many times.
I'm Hilda Foster Jones, and I can remember going to a birthday party when I was 5 years old. And then we enjoyed our ride back home backwards from the party.
Lorraine Thompson, and I rode the interurban many times to the doctor and I don't remember as the condition of the cars and anything, but I always thought it was fun. I always had a lot of fun.
I'm Edith Fern Grable, and it was always a thrill to ride it, and it seemed like it went so fast. It was sad to see it because it was handy. Cars began to be popular and better roads and everything, so I can understand why it folded.
Yes, sir. Well, they tell me that I was 100 recently, 5th day of January. Oh, yes, his biggest ambition had always been to be the motorman, or the engineer, rather, of a large railroad. That's what he had headed for.
A cottage, located just north of the John and Elizabeth Brenner Memorial Cemetery, was purchased by the school board and rented out. In 1920, this school seceded from the Lakeside District. The cottage was rented for 3 years and called East Lakeside. It was a one-room school with a stove in the center. 1st through 4th were taught there until 1924. Albert Brenner kept many in the community busy during the summer picking strawberries. Each were paid by the basket with his own handmade coins that could be cashed in on Fridays at the bank in Parkville. Although wheat threshing was a time of much work, it was also a time of great excitement. It was a time when Brenner rich neighbors came together to work side by side for a common goal. It was a way of solving problems together and cooperating with those around you. It is this balance between rugged individualism and hearty collaboration that built the American Midwest and still defines Riverside today.
She grew up in the old house where the John Deere picnics were held. After she accepted a marriage proposal from Leslie Renner, her father gave her 1 acre for them to build a home on, and they proceeded to do so. Leslie had gone out of town and 20-year-old Carolina wrote,
"Leslie dear, I thought instead of this time calling you over the phone to tell you what I want, I would be able to explain myself so you can understand just what I want to say by writing this note to you. It's 9:30 and I am about to retire. It's so doggone cold here in my room I am not going to write any longer than necessary. I went down to the house, and if you get seed tomorrow we need 20 pounds of alfalfa and enough bluegrass to sow our acre. You don't have to tell them you intend putting it all on just 1 acre so it will be good and thick. I noticed they weren't making our outside cellar entrance, or did you decide not to have one? It doesn't make a difference to me if they have one or not. Just if we ever need a new furnace we could get it down there, and I don't know if the one in the kitchen would be big enough for that or not. Guess they'll work on the foundation tomorrow. They have the cement mixer there and everything. It sure looks pretty good to me. Yours."
The home was built
Carolina
facing the
Brenner.
road to Parkville. One day Met Shippey was walking to Parkville and noticed the abundant ancient artifacts in Carolina's yard, and with her permission, he walked the land and drew a sketch. He would send his findings to the National Museum and requested someone to come and investigate. Today, we call the National Museum the Smithsonian Institute, and they would come 14 years later and eventually credited Shippey with one of the greatest Kansas City area finds.
Why did they come? Fruits, vegetables, fish, game, and no one to bother them. No white men especially. People lived here, gave birth, died, buried, dead 1,000 years ago. I think that it's fairly important in an age of isolation that human beings have some concept of the ongoing nature of the human experience.
The Belgian bottoms were farmed by the names such as the De Conics, Van de Populaire and the De Mouliniers. Many of the small roads there were named after them. Today, most of the bottoms is known as the Horizons.
Directly across from my home was the Brenner Cemetery where my great-great-grandparents, the founding Heinrich and Susanna, were buried. Beside the cemetery was a building known as East Lakeside School. North of our home, a corner of our farm was given to form School District Number 74, and given the name Brenner Ridge. The school had 2 large classrooms for grades 1 to 4 and 5 to 8. Rows of seats and desks were nailed to 1-by-4-inch boards so the seats could easily be moved. To clean the floor, an oily, red, sawdust floor compound was sprinkled, and then swept to control dust and dirt. There was a huge wooden door between classrooms that could be raised into the ceiling, so the classrooms could become one big area. Often a stage would be placed in one room and the big movable door would serve as a curtain. An active PTA would often invite guest speakers. One I particularly remember for his commanding voice was a large man named H. Roe Bartle, Martha Brenner Noland.
It had become known a developer was considering a horse track where an old greyhound dog track had been earlier. He asked the citizens to annex the area highlighted where part of that would become the horse track. That developer was Tom Pendergast. Would be what it is today. People who owned the land where the track would be, were paid well and the development brought jobs. Pendergast took advantage of a court ruling allowed a limited form of donation gambling. The park was generally known as Pendergast's Track, although his name did not appear on the legal papers. However, the names of his business associates and close friends were prominent in the list and the Pendergast Association stuck. In a matter of months, Riverside had more than doubled in size, nearly 25 years before it would become an official fourth-class city. Work began and the track was ready to open by June 7, 1928. There were 2 seasons per year for racing, 30 days in the spring and 30 days in the fall at the rate of 8 races per day.
Our yearly school trip was to the American Royal. There were no school buses and few had cars, so Alfred Drenner would put clean straw in the bottom of his cattle truck and we high school students would pile into a meat packing plant, Palmaloy Ive peat soap plant, spending the rest of the day at the Royal. Martha Brenner Noland.
The track began as a 3/4 mile but was soon enlarged to a full mile. These crowds were a major factor in Pendergast's push for the widening of the highway from a 2-lane to a 4-lane and the construction of the Fairfax Bridge to race season. Fire destroyed the bleachers. But within hours, Pendergast had bulldozers scooping up the debris. He brought in floodlights and a 24-hour work crew. 4 opening day new grandstands were complete.
Season brought special times. In the fall, Halloween house parties were held in homes. There were costume contests with the usual apple dunking, hot chocolate and donuts. A non-malicious prank was running sticks down the clapboard houses. My father, good-naturedly, was the brunt of a Halloween joke. Each year the morning after Halloween, as he delivered milk, his farm buggy or his farm wagon would be on top of the Rock Interurban Station in Northmore. It was then smiling, guilty.
Meantime, on the east side of town the Cuban Gardens opened in 1929. It was a front for an illegal gambling casino. At one point the Platte County Sheriff's Department tried to raid it 5 times in a row. However, one had to go through the front gate some distance from the garden themselves. This gave the guards at the gate time to call the managers inside, who apparently quickly converted the gambling back to dinner and dancing only. Once law enforcement officials left, almost certainly the gaming tables were back in operation.
Our line of communication was a hand-rung wall telephone connected to a party line. Our phone number was 642, our personal ring was a short and then a long. Rings to other homes on the line denoted 2 longs, 3 longs, a long and short, long shot long. To reach the operator in Parkville, 1 long ring or turn of the handle was required to place other calls. To reach persons on the lines, unless someone was talking, 1 just rang the correct ring. The school had double desks with ink wells. Some boys liked to dip the girls' ponytails in them. There was a heating stove in the middle of the room and a 12-inch platform in front so the teacher could keep an eye on things. Reading, writing, arithmetic, penmanship and geography were among some of the subjects taught to all grades. School books were handed down from family to family until they fell apart. Older boys usually could only attend 2 to 3 months during the winter when the weather was too bad to farm. Lelia Keller, 1921. Fita Grocery was the epitome of old-fashioned family business. Jim Fita, Sr. founded his grocery and general store in 1934 and was located east of the present Red X store. Fita Grocery was known for its good-natured humor and warmth. Many customers still recall the sign near the old-fashioned cash register, "In God We Trust, but you pay cash." Jim Fita, Jr., recalled recently that the business also involved delivery of ice and coal throughout the area. The coal was used to heat many area homes and the ice, chopped from area creeks during the winter, was used in early refrigerators and ice boxes. It was definitely a family business. We lived behind there and all of us worked, Mom, Dad and 4 children, Jim Fita, Jr. now recalls. In the 1950s, E.H. Ed Young of Red X fame purchased the business, but not before it had left its mark on Riverside. It was great because we knew all of our customers and they knew us. Ferdinando Filger opens Filger Oil, began Filger Oil Company in 1936 at 4533 Gateway. The building was originally built by Jerry Carver and had been known as Jolly Jerry's. Over the years the old gas station and cafe would be a Texaco station and the cafe would transform into Mary's Cafe, then Reese's, and 47 years later, would become the first corner cafe.
An Atlas station opened at the northern edge of town by the old Alma Howder House. After 14 years of persistent pleas from Ship E, Waldo Vadel brought a team to investigate the Renner site for 4 weeks in June of 1937. Professor Vadel was from the National Museum. He would go on to write what remains the definitive report on the Renner site. His findings were confined to the Renner's chicken yard where his team recovered an amazing array of artifacts.
Bern was a good man to me. He had me do a lot of handyman work for him, where he would sit and watch and tell me racing stories. You could see his hands were all crooked from years of holding onto the horse reins, I guess, and he was also bow-legged. He was slightly hunchback in a chair, and he had the appearance of sitting on a horse all the way up until he passed away. I never asked him if he won anything like the Kentucky Derby or anything like that, but he did tell me one time about one particular race that I recreated for you here, and this is how it would have went.
On a normal race day, jockeys were up at 6 a.m. to begin exercising the horses and then checking the charts to see what horses they would be riding that afternoon. Jockeys would draw their riding numbers and do their required routines until the 1 p.m. weigh-in. A jockey might have ridden 5 to 8 mounts a day, a grueling schedule requiring physical training and constant dieting, plus a thorough knowledge of horses and how to ride them. Vern Davis of Riverside had spent most of his work and free time riding horses. By the time of age 13, he was competing in the bushes, local events and county fairs. At 105 pounds, he was perfect for a jockey.
I came to Riverside the year it opened. I was just a kid and it was the big time, even though it was not a recognized track. They didn't have betting, they had donations. If you won, you went to the window and got a refund. It was a really great place to be. There was a restaurant right there in the clubhouse. They had sandwiches and everything in the grandstand.
Davis had been riding under contract to another stable when Riverside opened. The owner brought him to the new facility and sold his contract to a large stable at. He rode at all of its brief life.
People would come out and make a day of it. My last year or so I worked with Tom Pendergast. He was the best man in the world. He liked all of the stable hands and all of the riders. He was a really good man to me. I had my wife and 2 kids in a trailer traveling all the United States. We'd New Orleans to Florida. My first winter of racing was even in Cuba. We knew we'd survive somehow. Shoot the horse and send Davis on down the brook.
Who looks good to you?
How do you know?
Look, I like this one. Lucky Dan in the 3rd race.
Who's the jockey?
Van Davis and his numbers look great.
Sounds like a good horse. Let's.
You're a gutless cheat as well. Take all of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is on a road, calling the 3rd race at Riverside Park in Kansas City. It's up, and they're off and running.
I can still remember that track. You should have seen it with all those people. Boy, it sure was something all right.
Toil for my kids, sweat wrinkled and gray, while that lucky old sun has nothing to do but roll around.
Later, with electricity, we had a Brunswick cabinet radio with record player which provided music, news, especially that of the bird expedition in Antarctica, prize fights, presidential elections, and FDR's fireside chats. On Saturday nights the rug was rolled up and my older sisters and friends would dance. A Phillips 66 filling station opened close to our home, across the street from the north end of the trip. Cousins and local boys worked and congregated there. Jolly Jerry's Texaco station was only a block south of the junction of Highway 71 and Vivian. A ball diamond behind the restaurant drew crowds for Sunday baseball, especially for donkey baseball games. There were movies on Saturday nights. Russell Brenner had a grocery store and it was there that I saw my first sliced bread. Louis Brenner later had a hardware store. This junction was a drop-off point for a jitney that provided transportation from North Kansas City. This area of Vivian Road and Gateway became the main crossroad when Brenner Ridge became part of incorporated Riverside.
Riverside's business growth has been interesting, with family businesses and large companies both playing significant roles. Since World War II, the three most significant were Filger Oil Company, Red X Store and the Eagle Animal Hospital. Filger started his business in 1936 while Ed Young started Red X in June of 1948. Dr. Eagle began in November of that same year. Many other businesses have come and gone since, such as Sloan's Restaurant, Mrs. Eldridge's Tavern, Bush's Barber Shop and the Riverside Rack. Many gas stations and quite a few billboard signs, too. This was the America of Route 66.
Riverside today has a surprising diversity in its makeup. And one of the most surprising is evident in the area known as the Belgium Bottoms. Filling the southwest corner of Riverside toward Parkville, this area of the Missouri River Valley was settled by approximately 10 families from Belgium. Riverside resident Gus van de Populier said his grandfather, Gustav van de Populier, was one of the first. In 1946, Dr. Thomas Eagle converted an old dairy barn into the Eagle Animal Hospital. Dr. Eagle built living quarters in the back of the hospital. Eagle sold the business in 1965 to Dr. Thomas Noyes, who would go on to sell it to Dr. James T. Sparks in 1996. It is the longest ongoing business in Riverside, having opened 5 years before the city was incorporated.
While driving on 45 highway, Dr. Eagle helped put out a house fire with the aid of a livestock stomach pump he had with him.
E.H. Young played one of the most significant roles in Riverside's history. Both visibly and behind the scenes, he was a community leader in the true sense of the idea. He founded Red X, which began as a small cinder block building. His idea of a department grocery store paved the way for general stores such as Walmart and Kmart. Riverside in the late 1940s. He opened the Red X General Store in June 1948. He experienced 3 devastating floods and a major fire and used his patented humor to create his advertising slogan of, "The home of high water, hot fires and low prices." Commonwealth Amusement Corporation opens the Riverside Drive-In on July 22, 1948. It had a 6-story screen, facilities for 900 cars and included refreshment stands, lakes with colored lights and a children's play area. The scene took 41,200 board feet of lumber and sat on a 105-yard 3-footing capable to stand a wind stress of 120 miles per hour. Mr. Young opens the half-mile Riverside Speedway dirt track on June 3, 1951. On its third weekend, it was to feature a heavyweight prize fight with Rex Lane and Marvin Jensen, but was rained out. Among names of drivers over the years, some were Greg, Jerry and Kenny Weld, Judd Larson, John Fleming, Jerry Beach and Jim Penny, where many went on to compete in the Indianapolis 500. Mr. Young read an article in the morning paper where Parkville was about to annex Riverside. Young quickly met at a restaurant with Vic Panis, who was the Indian Hills developer and attorney. Also present was Bert Filger and another business owner. They agreed to go meet with the Parkville mayor, who agreed not to annex. However, Parkville encouraged the Riverside group to seek other avenues because Kansas City would likely attempt it. A community meeting was held at the Brenner Ridge School to discuss possible boundaries. By the end of the meeting, several neighborhoods elected to remain their own group, and the communities of Northmore, Houston Lake, Northern Heights and Riverside were formed. Young, Panis and Filcher met with Platte County presiding judge, A. J. Heiligson, and on June 21, 1951, presented a petition for incorporation. On June 26, the court issued an order declaring the city of Riverside. Filcher was appointed mayor by the court and sworn in by Young. The other officials were Roy Renner, Dr. Eagle and Will Scrivener. John Scott, Marshall and Lowell Brenner, collector.
In the early 50s, my husband and I bought 2.5 acres in Riverside on a gravel road. Oh, and that valley road? It's now called High Drive. Betty Burch, 2001.
Look at this photograph. Every time I do, it makes me laugh. How did our eyes get so red? And what the hell is on Joey's head? This is where I grew up. I think the president owner fixed it up. I never knew we ever went without. The second floor is hot for sneaking out. And this is where I went to school. Most of the time had better things to do. Criminal record says I've broken twice. I must have done it 6 times. I wonder if it's too late. Should I go back and try to graduate? Life's better now than it was back then. If I was them, I wouldn't let me in. Oh, God, every memory of looking out the back door. I have a photo album spread out on my bedroom floor. It's hard to say it, time to say it. Goodbye, goodbye. Every memory of walking out the front door. I found the photo of the friend that I was looking for. It's hard to say it, time to say it. Goodbye, goodbye. Remember the old arcade? Blew every dollar that we ever made. The cops seen us hanging out. They say somebody went and burned it down. listen to the radio and sing along with every song we know. We said someday we'd find out how it feels to sing to more than just a steering wheel. Then Kim's the first girl I kissed. I was so nervous that I nearly missed. She's had a couple of kids since then. I haven't seen her since God knows when. Change. Every memory of looking out the back door. I have a photo album spread out on my bedroom floor. It's hard to say it, time to say it. Goodbye, goodbye. Every memory of walking out the front door. I found the photo of the friend that I was looking for. It's hard to say it, time to say it. Goodbye. Every time I do it makes me laugh. Every time I do it makes me.
Over the 4 weeks, the team recovered scores of artifacts. The excavation was next to Vadal's, which had been 17 years earlier.
In the 1950s, Missouri allowed cities to levy a tax on gasoline, and some cities had a fairly steep tax up to 7 or 8 cents a gallon. Considering that gasoline might be as little as 17 cents a gallon, it was obvious that motorists would notice a tax that might be 30 to 50% of their cost. But Riverside had no such tax, and as a result, people would drive from throughout the Kansas City area to fill up.
Two stock boys discovered the fire in the stock room in the 43,000 square foot store at 3:30 in the afternoon. By 9 o'clock, only a wall of the filling station section remained standing. 20 additions had been made in the 9 years, and a new 10,000 square foot addition for a drugstore was being added. Mr. Young was in the store at the time and said,
"I ran into an apartment used by the night watchman to see what I could save. The only thing I saw was an electric saw. I carried it out and thought it was a pretty good item to save if I'm going to have to rebuild the whole thing. We're gonna survive this thing somehow."
A group of TWA pilots built and opened the Skyline Inn. It was considered the finest motel north of the river at the time and a cost of $250,000. It first opened with only 22 units, and additional units were added later. The motel provided free, hourly transportation to the air terminal. The pilot/owers were Leon Vestal, Art Dunlop, Kenny Marks, Al Weber, and Jim Goodman. Red X had over 20 additions and a total rebuild after the '57 fire. Here we see Red X over a 62-year period. Many will remember a miniature golf course that was behind today's Corner Cafe. Waltz became Kenny's about 1960 and remains Kenny's today. A $4,000 engine for a stock car race.
Mr. and Mr. S. Filger with Mr. Young at the Wyandotte County Fair. Names like Dairy King and Dog N' Suds made the area popular with all ages. By 1963, the Riverside Police Department was in serious trouble. Orb Reynolds was hired as the director September and he resigned that December. Intercontinental Engineering opens on the far west side of the Belgian Bottoms and remains one of the largest structures in southern Platte County. In 1963 it produces the largest pneumatic tire tractor in the world.
Riverside resident, Jim Erickson, lived on Hahn Drive and worked at a gas station in Platte Woods known today as the Autobahn. Riverside experienced explosive development throughout the 1960s. One of the most memorable to many was Griff's. It was located not far behind today's clock tower at the intersection of Vivian and Gateway, where once you could get burgers for as low as 19 cents.
At one time in the 60s, Red X briefly had a Western auto store.
Dairy Queen opens in 1963 to the delight of many. Meanwhile, plans were in the works to build I-635, which would cut off Vivian Road.
Dairy Queen?
Line Creek flash flood in 1966. Sock hops were once held at a community center that once was behind St. Matthew's Church. One gig featured the Four Chessmen. One of the band members went on to become a member of the band, Missouri, where they had a hit song called Movin' On.
Mr. Young continued his quest for innovative way of luring customers into the store. One of the kid favorites was the magic mirrors that were just inside the main entrance, where they could make you look skinny, tall, fat or short.
Let's groove. Let's dance.
Mr. Young built an amusement park for kids at the far northeast corner of the parking lot. It had just about everything kids under the age of 12 would want. It gave parents something to do with the kids before the racetrack would open that evening, or let mom have time in the store while dad took the kids to Kittyland. Each ride was 1 cent. Local neighborhood ice cream trucks would give a free ticket with each purchase. He closed it about 1970 and would later say that closing it was one of his biggest business regrets. He had a second Kittyland and store briefly 95th and Metcalf.
After 10 years, David Swetnam retires as municipal judge. Less than a year after opening, Warren's building burns to the ground.
Gary Hoheimer took over as acting chief of police after Chief Seneca resigned to do investigative work for a private firm. He had been chief for 6 years.
Two-time Grammy Award winner, Charlie Rich, was known to have played unannounced at the Crossroads. Rich was known as the Silver Fox, and bar quickly changed its name. He had the hit, "The Most Beautiful Girl." The Renner-Brennerside Park becomes the first property in Platte County to be put on the National Register of Historic Places. Here, Carolina Renner, whose maiden name was Brenner, is proudly showing the plaque.
The North Twin Drive-In was opened on April 5, 1970. It was located across from East Slope Cemetery on Northwest 51st Street, which is the actual location of the old entrance. It was owned by Mid-America Cinema and managed by Ralph Lee Sutton. It was a 2-screen theater that could hold 6,400 cars. The twin box offices could keep the 4 lanes of traffic moving. It featured a 2-story projection booth over the air-conditioned refreshment stand. There was a playground for children on the west side of the building. Riverside was totally dependent on mutual aid up to 1973, when Chief Hoheimer formed the Department of Public Safety. He became upset with the response to a large fire at El Chaparral. Past attempts had been made, but volunteers were hard to find. Their option was to join the Southern Platte County Fire Protection District, which was actually called the Community Fire Association. This association kept a 1948 pumper in Riverside. The association had an annual fee of $10 to $25 per home, per year. A non-association member who had a fire was given a bill for $250. In 1971, the association threatened to cut their ties with Riverside because it cost more training, and the city council offered incentive of an extra $50 a month for being a Riverside resident. 19 officers were with the department in 1973. Hoheimer had gotten 34 applications from those who wanted to volunteer. In those years, it was up to the city council. In 1975, the city purchased Clacomo's 1953 Seagraves pumper for $4,000. During this 1973-75 time frame, Colin Campbell, chairman of the Associated Residents and Merchants of Riverside, ARMOR, got the Missouri City's water company to agree to install 34 more hydrants. Between 75 and 79 they purchased a large the 1976 Ford stayed in service until 2000. There was a rule that the fire engine couldn't leave the bay for a fire unless there were at least 4 firemen on board. Hoheimer was fired in June of 1979 because of complaints of poor management. Jerry Wingo, a former captain, was named as the replacement. In 1979, when the additional 3 bays were added to the old City Hall and the old bays were converted into a larger communications area. It shouldn't be lost that Hoheimer is still credited with beginning the fire department. He often worked on the old fire truck himself, for no pay to keep it running. In 1980, Mr. Young anonymously donates $5,000 for a city park fund.
Riverside is a giant trash heap with absolutely no one taking responsibility for its public safety or its out-of-control bars. Just how long its elected officials continue to allow this mayhem remains to be seen. The abuse of their own policies spirals out of control and needs someone to come forward and lead this city. Rich Hood, 1981. Three entrance signs were made to inform the community of important information as well as starting a newsletter called The Riverside Story. A contributing writer on history was Gary Brenner.
Pride and Progress sold whiskey barrels full of flowers to businesses and maintained them.
In 1982, the City Council establishes the Park Board. The city received ornamental pear trees through a grant that lined Gateway and Vivian for years.
Fall festivals began in 1976 and all the games were completely free. The all-day event was ran by volunteers from a city budget of less than $1,000. The day began with a parade from Red X to the junction of Vivian and Gateway and on to the City Hall. During its peak, it was difficult to find a place to watch it. The evening would be a street dance lasting into the evening, and the next morning would be a pancake breakfast at the Renner Park. For volunteers, it was a very long day.
All this contributed to the city winning the Love Thy Neighborhood competition sponsored by Kansas City's Clean City Commission. Gary Brenner picked up the award on behalf of the city in September 1981.
The city bought American flags and Christmas ornaments to be flown on every light pole along Gateway, Vivian and West Platte during holidays.
It's fairly important to note, this was all community involvement born out of the desire to show the area what we could be. Suddenly, neighbors who rarely spoke, were watering flour barrels together on a Saturday morning or buying hot dogs for each other at the festival. It was a sense of community pride and spirit that can only come from getting and being involved. It was a Riverside story. On January 24, 1985, business owner, Jim Cohen responded to the delivery bell at the back of his store at 10 a.m. He saw smoke as he entered the back of the store and immediately called the fire department. Riverside nearly lost its new pumper when the front wall of the business collapsed just after the pumper had been moved. Later investigations concluded a water heater as the cause. Besides the Town and Country Hardware, apartments above the store were destroyed as well as the Pilger Oil warehouse. Other businesses impacted were VJ's baseball cards and barbershop and the corner cafe. All the buildings were eventually demolished to make way for the new corner cafe. Jim would go on to run Mr. Young's hardware store at Red X for a while before retiring.
It sat vacant for years, so after considerable remodeling, Mr. Young invited Parkville's Bell Road Barn players to use the old rancho as their new home. It had a gala opening on April 14, 1987. Sadly, it would be completely destroyed 6 years later during the flood of 1993.
Normally around the end of February and first week of March, the Army Corps of Engineers begin releasing water from the 6 reservoirs in the Dakotas and Montana on the Missouri River. The winter of 92-93 was brutally harsh and lingered into early spring with a late winter blast that prevented the Corps from being on time. Then the unexpected happened. A stationary front moves north and quickly melts the snowpack almost overnight. With it came severe storms and torrential rain. It was just about the last thing the Corps needed. The stationary front eventually stalls out and meanders from Minnesota to Arkansas about every 3 to 4 days. Each time the front brought heavy rain over the region it was at that day. The Missouri River stayed at near flood stage all spring into late May. Riverside officials kept an eye on the river, but their focus was choosing just the right gambling company. That decision was made on June 1st. Mayor Betty Burch would say,
"It's a big night for us. But it was tough. I believe it's the hardest thing I've ever had to do since I've been mayor."
By late June, the Corps had no choice but to open the gates more at the last stop between here and there. Between May 13 and July 27, the Missouri River crested above flood stage 8 times. George Flaws, Larry Reese and Marty Rowe manned the mobile command center that was set up on the northwest corner of Vivian and Gateway. Vivian Road was now underwater at High Drive, where from there to Gateway had to be done by Northwood Road and to the I-29 exit. Permits were given to Riverside residents and business owners to hang from their rear view mirrors. Different color permits meant different things. This was necessary to prevent looting.
Among those sandbagging were sons, daughters and grandkids from those involved with the incorporation 42 years before. Also sandbagging were the descendants of the original settlers who faced an eerily similar flood 149 years ago.
Mr. Young made his last visit to the store the Thursday before the crest.
A preliminary damage assessment done by city officials resulted in a finding of losses to individual business owners of over $71 million. This loss equals approximately $27,000 for each man, woman, and child in town.
We owned a business on Tullison Road just north of where Argosy is today. It had been a week since we'd been there, and back then we were able to drive. This time it would be by boat. We got permission and headed out. It was about the scariest ride I ever had. It was about a half-mile trip, but it took over 30 minutes because of the current. There were trees, boards, and everything you could imagine that could float to avoid. We got there and floated around the building, and I couldn't take it anymore and wanted to head back. We had lost all the product we had stored. Somebody told us before we left to watch out for snakes, so my eyes were scanning the water. I thought I saw a snake and it was coming near the boat, so I screamed. My husband said it was a little rabbit. It was about to give up, and I still can't believe it had made it that far. My husband kept going, and I pleaded for him to turn around and get it. He fought to avoid some large debris chunks coming at us and somehow ring overnight and let it go the next morning. Brenda Peeler.
It was 2 days before the crest. The water was up to I-635. It was closed. The only time I ever used my Go Anywhere Pass was that day. The Corps had a checkpoint all the way back to 56th Street on I-29. I told them I just needed to drive to Kansas and back to look at the river. They gave me 10 minutes. I came down 635 past High Drive and was shocked with all the water. I made the slow turn where you could get off to go to Fairfax and headed towards the Missouri River Bridge. The closer I got, I started to see about a dozen deer on part of the remaining agricultural levee. That section was maybe 50 yards long. The deer were running as fast as they could back and forth looking for a way off. I drove over the bridge and came back. That may be in that short time. That section of the levee and the deer were gone. Just like that. I-635 broke about an hour later. But that vision of the trapped deer will always haunt me. Gary Brenner.
The stench from the river was unbearable as sandbags weren't any use. The feeling of hopelessness and despair was all around as the cleanup seemed like an impossible task. Some businesses were wiped out and couldn't return. It was as if the city itself had nearly died.
Goes down, we're going to be in here and we're going to go back to work and we're going to go back into business. We're going to survive this thing somehow.
As the water goes down, we are going to put a plan in place that we will begin with a massive cleanup in this city.
arms as it arrived and was set to open on June 23. As part of their agreement with the city, they handed over $600,000 to Mayor Burch and the City Council. It was a relief of unbelievable magnitude. For nearly 3 decades, we've marveled of all the glorious changes. More importantly, we survived.
I am looking at a tornado. This is my own. You see this thing right in front of me. I would have to get, it's big, and I'd have to... I see one. Look at the... And I'm right in. I gotta close.
Congress approved the L. 385 levy for study with the Flood Control Act of 1944. Nothing happened until the flood of '93, which prompted the Corps of Engineers to start in September of 1997 and completed in May of 2005.
Doesn't need 2 coats. 1 coat. Cody said 2 coats. So
I've had worse motel guests than this, trust me. 39 Shriners came through here one Halloween night. Boy, howdy.
You make it out to those people right there.
Another buck.
Why?
I'm completely out of names.
Oh, well, it looks like you're going to need a lot of books. You ready?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Life was simple during these years, but certainly not boring. Reflections on the past leave enduring memories. Submitted by Martha Brenner Noland.